All right, we're back here with Junius's theses on the Father and the Son from his Disputations, and we're working on the doctrine of the Father, which it might be the most neglected section of Trinitarian theology for the average person. It's when you come to the doctrine of the first person of the Trinity, the Father, that you find people saying out loud, instructed Christian people saying things that are in fact not about the first person of the Trinity at all, but about the divine essence or about the entire Trinity or about God just as such.
Right.
So that the actual doctrine about the Father is sort of under resourced or underpopulated in most minds.
What would you say, Fred, are some of the drawbacks of that neglect of the personhood of the Father in just Trinitarian theology broadly?
Yeah, well, just on a chart, you start to notice, oh, I actually don't have information active in my mind about this person. So there's a lopsidedness here. And what you end up losing, I think, is there is a danger of depersonalizing your overall understanding of God. Because instead of saying things about the relation of the Father to the Son that help you pick out the distinct person of the Father, you start talking about the omni attributes and sovereignty, all of which are great, true, and things that we must talk about in the doctrine of God. But they sort of lack that infinite depth of personal grounding that you get by having some solid ideas about who the first person is.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like Junius will be really helpful then here. What are we looking at today?
Yeah, we're looking at the third, fourth, and fifth theses. There are 31 theses total in this disputation. 13 of them are on the Father, which, just one more comment about the doctrine of the Father, there's not a name for the doctrine about God the Father, right? We have Christology, we have pneumatology, but if you want the name for the doctrine specifically about the first person of the Trinity, which is what we're doing today, there is no name. You can't say patrology because that's the study of the church fathers. I know a few people who have coined the word paterology.
I've heard that, yes.
Yeah, which is more directly from the Greek, that's a fine thing to do. It just hasn't taken. I can't think of any theological literature that routinely uses a set term for the doctrine about the first person. Okay, so knowledge of the Father, theses 3, 4, and 5. The thesis 3, and I'm reading here from your translation. Junius says, we will not demonstrate that the Father is true God. The Holy Scripture teaches this with innumerable testimonies, because all openly acknowledge this, though by different arguments, and none deny it, except those who deny that God is, because they do not concede anything related to nature or to Scripture. So that's the first part of this thesis, is what he's not going to prove. He's not going to bother proving the deity of the Father, just because there's no one to argue with on that subject. If you think there's a God, then when you start talking about God the Father, you immediately acknowledge the deity of the Father.
Right. There's always a principle without a principle. It's just the question of whether he principles other persons and thus is the eternal Father.
Right. Probably a clue here to what kind of document Junius has written here as a disputation. He's not simply working through an abstract set of all the things that are true, and then making sure to fill out each subpoint in his outline. This is just not a relevant matter of Christian teaching that you need to go ahead and do the work of going through Scripture to prove that there's a God. He says the only people you'd argue with there are people who deny everything that is taught by nature and by Scripture.
Right. Both those books of Revelation in the unequal way that they attest to God, but nonetheless both confirming existence. Yeah. It's quite a striking comment. It's very
It is, and certainly there must be other disputations on these subjects. And his point is, if we're going to focus on the Father here in our 13 theses on this person, we're not going to be spending our time on that. So, on the other hand, he says, still in thesis 3, we prove with testimony and with reason that the Father is a person really distinct from the Son. But, he says, only with one word.
Right, and with that, this is my translator's footnote here. It's a little bit difficult to tell exactly what Junius is getting at with this last phrase, only with one word. I think, as we'll see in the next thesis in a moment, he's talking about a word that Scripture mentions in the book of Hebrews, chapter 1, namely the word hypostasis, or person in Greek, roughly speaking. But it's a bit strange, this last comment here.
Yeah. Yeah, and thesis 3 doesn't have a lot in it. It's kind of clearing the ground or establishing what the work's going to be. We're not going to prove the deity. We are going to prove, what's his language, that the Father is a person really distinct from the Son.
Yeah, I think the only thing that this really brings to the fore is this two-pronged thing that he labels here with testimony and with reason.
Yes.
This is a bit strange wording in comparison, at least to the high medievals, or Junius is in air, but he's also developing medieval theology and the theology of the fathers. But these are the two ways that are always brought into talking about Trinity, either with respect to the authority of Scripture being primary, and then authority of a father or a church doctor, and then the ratio or the reason here is going to be analogy. Mm-hmm. It's actually not going to be natural reason. It's the ratio, which is an analogy, which is going to be an argument from fittingness, if we're talking about the order of judgments and dogmatics, proving something is the case, or is going to serve as illustrative for what is being asserted via the authority that's been offered.
Yeah, good. So testimony here, that's the authority. He's going to appeal to some authority to demonstrate the distinct personhood of the Father. And he's also going to have an argument. But I like the way you brought out ratio and analogy, because those are more, what's the right way to talk about the words ratio and analogia? They've more obviously got two parts to them, right? There's some kind of fit of reason to the thing proved.
Right, and it always has to rest on some higher authority that tells you that, at least in the mind of Junius, I mean, there are other people in the tradition who would disagree, but I think at least the common position is that supernatural revelation is required in order to demonstrate the Trinity. So you can only get it by a testimony.
Yeah.
But there's also reason, which is supplementary in a certain sense, or illustrative via analogy.
Right. I suppose it's possible that we're going to jump into Thesis 4 here and see what he brings forth. It's possible that what he brings forth from Scripture, from Hebrews, is itself both an authority and an argument.
For sure.
And maybe that's what he's pointing to, is I'm going to grab this one word from the book of Hebrews, and you'll see that, like, first of all, he probably thought of Paul the Apostle as the author of Hebrews, but at least he's doing apostolic authority by getting this word. And the word itself kind of has an argument within it. Okay, so Thesis 4 then, that he is a person, the apostle teaches in Hebrews 1, when he says the Son is the character of the hypostasis of the Father. The argument taken from the definition of person concludes likewise. So there's this argument. Well, let's stick to the authority for a minute. The testimony that he gets from Hebrews chapter 1. The Son is the, what does a modern English translation say? The exact imprint of his...
always goes with nature or essence.
Of his nature or essence, yeah.
Yeah, but it's kind of a thorny word, because hypostasis becomes something of a loaded term in Trinitarian theology, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, for a while in the 4th century, you got the Greek fathers reading the Greek New Testament, and they're also drawing on all the historical background that you get for this word hypostasis, which in itself, just etymologically, hypo is under and stasis is standing. So it's that which stands under, that reality which stands underneath anything that presents itself to you. What's its hypostasis? One of the problems with that is it's sort of vague, right? That word in itself is subject to lots of uses, that which stands under something. Then you make a distinction, like, do you mean like what essentially stands underneath it? Or do you mean that which personally stands underneath it as distinct? Oh, well, that's the whole question in working with some of these Nicene categories.
Right.
So the other awkwardness is that if you do the same move in Latin, it's substantia, right? That which stands under something. And so making the move from language to language there, it's not immediately clear what you're going to do with it. You have to sort of specify by use that you're going to use hypostasis to mean the person.
Right. So there would be ways that hypostasis could be used and maybe was used even in Greek theology at various times that wouldn't apply here, is what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah. And that you got to keep your wits about you, because in the early 4th century, the pro-Nicene theologians could use hypostasis to refer to what there's one of in God, the essence. And after a few decades of sort of having to clean all that up, they realized, what if we just sanctified this word for use to talk about what there's 3 of in God?
Yeah.
And then what if we were consistent with that? And that's when the tradition kind of takes on a new clarity, I think.
Right. So I think even a few centuries later, you mentioned the difficulty also translating between Greek and Latin and trying to sort out that mess as well. But eventually, hypostasis, as it's codified and how it's going to be sacredly used in Trinitarian theology, is what the Latins mean by persona, or by person, as it's used in Trinitarian theology.
Right. So Junius is sort of downstream from all that. He's aware of the development and certainly the authoritative use. And he's looking at the word hypostasis in his text of Hebrews and saying, that's the word where you can see that the Son is the character of the hypostasis of the Father.
Right.
And that there is a distinction here between the two.
Mm-hmm.
Just looking around Hebrews, you could do this a little differently if you think about the sun as the brightness of the glory, the effulgence of the glory of God. You wouldn't have to do anything like say that the Father is the glory and the Son is the brightness of the glory. You could still have the glory of God be an essential statement, but with the Son as the brightness of it, you say, oh, there some personal distinction is occurring.
So tease that out. How are you figuring that? What's going on in that logic?
Yeah, you can make the distinction of one. Well, I mean, try to distinguish between the brightness and the glory, right? You can't have glory without brightness. If there's brightness, it argues glory, and it argues that it's standing in an ofness or fromness relationship to that glory.
Okay, so the suggestion of Scripture with the preposition of sourceness and principling is where you're going from?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's all kind of in the area of how Scripture itself talks about it. Junius doesn't need that. He just needs a word to function as a testimony for him to indicate, because all he's trying to prove is that the Father is a person distinct from the Son.
Right.
And actually, Thesis 5 is mainly about the nature of the distinctness. So in 4, all he's trying to get is that there is distinctness.
Yeah, that he is a person, I think he says right here at the beginning.
Yeah. And then he says, now the argument taken from the definition of person concludes likewise. A person is defined as a subsistence, which is determined with its characteristic or individual properties in some one intelligent individual, such that still he is not part of another. Now, because this definition accords with the Father, why would we not say that the Father is a person? So it's interesting that he goes to the testimony of Scripture first, and then on the basis of that, sort of, I don't know, in Thesis 4 here, sort of behind the scenes, he, rummages around and brings out the definition of person.
A very messy definition of person.
It is, yeah, and he immediately starts cleaning it up as soon as he said it. I mean, maybe the messiness here that you're referring to is something like he immediately starts describing persons as having properties.
Yeah.
Right. And as soon as you say persons have properties, you have to specify that you mean like, well, personal properties, of course, or by properties, I don't mean that there's a substance with properties. And that's what we're talking about here. Here I'm using properties in a sense appropriate to persons.
Right. And I think it's important to catch the fact that he's he's dipped down to how we define persons with respect to us. And, we know what persons are. And so that's where I think he can slip in these characteristic or individual properties, maybe without immediately getting into hot water when he zips up to Trinity. And then he says that this definition accords or is fitting for the Father, so we might as well use it, is roughly where he goes with this. It's a very minimalist argument. But still, even with that said, it's alluding to the definition of Boethius, among others, that the medieval tradition, a person is a subsistence of a rational nature, rational standing in there for intellectual nature. But it certainly is,
yeah. Well, yeah, like you say, the trick to, I think, Thesis 4 is just how little he's trying to establish. I think my mind is kind of greedy, and I immediately want to say, aha, definition of person, this is one we can work with at all levels of the whole system. And in fact, that's not true. There's a progressive character to how he's laying this out. Because like you say, it's not quite Boethius's definition, but it's informed by a bunch of the categories of Boethius's definition. Yeah, I see, categories is an Aristotle word. So these things are just hard to talk about at a distant enough level. You need words for stuff, but you can't say properties, you can't say categories. There's almost nothing you can say, if you're trying to keep it at the highest level of abstraction. Now, the definition accords with Father, so why wouldn't we say the Father is a person? Okay, and then we get to Thesis 5. That he is a person distinct from the Son is the next step, right? Person, okay, got that in 4. Now the distinctness. That he's a person distinct from the Son, not according to being, which is common, but subsisting, which is proper to each person. Scripture teaches in many passages with utmost clarity. Now, being here is esse, and subsisting is that just subsistere?
Yeah, subsistere.
Yeah. And what he needs to establish is that there's a distinction here, but not according to being, because if it were a distinction according to being, you'd have two beings, two distinct beings. So you want to prove distinctness, but you don't want to overprove distinctness, or you end up with two gods. And that would be an obvious error.
Right.
But it is going to be a distinction with regard to their subsisting, which he tells us that's the part that's proper to each person. Each person has its own subsistence, and there's a distinction of subsistence between them.
Yeah. And, there's so many words for both these two categories in the tradition. The key thing to keep in mind, as you point out, is the issue of commonness versus propriety, and that we're not making a division in what is common, whether we call that essence or being or esse or existence here. All of those are common in the common bucket. Subsisting or modes of subsisting, if we want to talk, how 20th century folks would do. There's lots of ways to talk about this individualizing, but as you say, it's that relative, which we'll get to later, bucket, which is proper to each person.
I'm not naturally philosophically minded about certain things, and so I'm easily satisfied by understanding sort of what the rules are and how they're going to function. And I can do that in kind of a blind way, or almost a fundamentalist way. You're like, well, what are the rules? And so I easily default to, what are there 3 of in God, and what is there 1 of in God? Or as you said, what is common and what is proper? What is proper to each person versus common to the 3 persons. And at the initial level, that's satisfactory. If I can keep myself from making those errors about attributing the oneness to the threeness or the threeness to the oneness, I'm pretty happy. There is something I think almost dumb about that, in that we're not just making up nonsense words and making sure we follow the rules correctly. Subsist is actually an interesting concept bearing thing that you can analyze, right? So subsistence as opposed to essence. You're actually doing some philosophy there. You're doing some metaphysics there. You're making some metaphysical distinctions beyond simply saying, here's a tag we're going to use for what there's 3 of, right?
Right.
I'm confessing a weakness when I say, like, I have to push on further to get to the philosophical depth. Because at one level, I'm just perfectly satisfied to say, I can get an A on the theology test and not say obviously false things if I know to use the word subsistence over here in 3 land.
Right. So there's a functional, there's something of a functional methodology that underlies these choice of terms, that as long as you're really adequate at functioning with these two non-overlapping categories, as it were, for us, you're going to be all right in the long run.
Yeah.
Are there other ways that this shows up, Fred, or that this, other tips and tricks? Communicating to a lot of folks, we can't start talking about esse versus subsistere. This is not going to work. So what do we do to try to translate this, but still keep what is of fundamental importance in view?
Yeah, it's I think it's audience specific. You just want to use the words for what is proper to each of the 3 persons. You want to use them in a way that doesn't accidentally tip over into sort of essential ontological distinction. So, not that I think I'm a better teacher than Junius, but at least talking to people in English, I would not use the word property to talk about what distinguishes the persons. I wouldn't say, the Father has the following properties, and then make a list of them. Because even if I got my list right, it's just a word that's going to pull people towards thinking of the Father as having his own being or essence or list of stuff he's got by nature of what he is.
So property, because it's absolute overtones, is that your concern, that it implies things down the road for folks?
Yeah. So some teachers, like say Calvin, will equally frustratingly say there's a certain distinguishing mark of each person, but he studiously avoids any word that sounds remotely ontological for what makes the Father the Father. That's a communication strategy, and it solves the problem I was just describing.
Yeah.
It raises other problems, one of which is you're going to spend an hour in the classroom with students staring at Institutes 1-113, saying like, what is a distinguishing mark? Well, like, what even is that? Yeah. And it's
there.
Yeah. It's more of a Renaissance rhetorical move than it is a philosophical distinction there in Calvin. And like I say, it does what he wants it to do.
Yeah.
It just kicks the can of some ontological questions a little further down the road.
So watch for terms that tip over into this absoluteness or this propriety of ownership, such that the Father has this and the Son doesn't have that.
Yeah.
Watch for those types of things.
Yeah. And in my rule keeping way, I would say when you're making a list of things in the Father that constitute the Father as Father, just make sure they're all fairly obviously open to the relation that has to be named, right? Mm-hmm. Like, here's the thing I said about the Father that's only true of the Father. And we know it sticks to the Father because it's referring to the Son or the Spirit in a certain way. Yeah.
That's good.
So it's tricky. Works better with a whiteboard, but Junius says here, Scripture teaches, again, this in many passages with utmost clarity. For instance, John 1:1, the Word was with God. John 1:18, John 14:10, which let me just cite that so it's not as famous as the others. Jesus says, "Do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The Father in me, the Father who dwells in me does his works." And so he says, in all the passages where the Father is said to be other than the Son, and other, the word here is alius, another one.
Yeah, the famous sanctified word that everyone says, okay, when we need to talk about this otherness, this is the word we will use in life.
Yeah. Now this word other designates distinction in person, and the distinction whereby one person is distinguished from another person is real. The same argument asserting these things is because the Son accepts his subsisting from the Father just as from the principle of his personality. And principle and principled are not the same in reality. So again, there's a kind of otherness you want to confess between the Father and the Son, but it's not the kind of otherness we would paraphrase as, well, certainly it's not another being. We already know that. It's also not the kind of otherness that we'd want to express as variety or diversity. So you're not getting a kind of, there are two different kinds of things in God. You get Father and Son, other from each other, in the sense that there is a real relation between them, and they are on the two ends of that real relation that's opposed.
Yeah. And we would want to say that distinction is real, which I find a very fascinating move that he pulls in here. Again, slipping down to the creaturely sphere, arguing the fact that semantic language, when scripture says other and it's distinguishing persons, we all know, whatever weird stuff we get in theology, that the distinction between you and me, Fred, is real. There's a lot of metaphysics that we might have to go to cycle through to clarify, and so on and so forth, but it's real. And so when scripture says this, the reality of this distinction is contained in the way it talks about this one and the other. And I just find that really helpful to really bring out to the fore as he has here.
Yeah. Good. So here in Thesis 5, we're still we're getting a lot more content than we've had in the previous two. He's actually trying to get into the nature of this otherness, but it's still early in his movement of thought about the distinctness of the Father and the otherness of the person of the Father. So he's still, even to talk about it, we're having to bring in some details that he'll get to a little bit later. I want to pick on the word here, accept. That the Son accepts his subsisting from the Father. I think it's fine, and I assume the Latin's pretty straightforward. Probably even a cognate here, right? You know, is it accepere or?
It is accepere.
Accepere. The only problem with this word is in contemporary English, to accept something from another sounds like you have two distinct personal wills with their own life history, and you offer me something, I consider whether I want it, and then I accept it from you. So you can kind of fill out this word to accept, which is a fine word, but you could fill it out with a whole sort of strong social Trinitarian sort of background or history or backstory, and that would be a mistake. The main problem with it is it would presuppose a timeless time before the acceptance of the Son's subsistence, where he considered whether or not he wanted to accept that subsistence. Like, you just have to go fully mythological with it and move yourself back to some substrate or some territory where Trinity was not yet Trinity, but the Son was deciding in himself to accept a thing from the Father, but the thing is his own subsistence. So that wouldn't make any sense.
Right. So are there other terms that you would suggest would be better?
Well, I mean, it's a gamble on whether receive does the right sort of communicating here.
This is so fascinating, because in Latin, this might be getting us farther afield, but accepere, accept versus receive, recipere, in the history of Trinitarian theology, especially in the medievals and the early moderns, are very distinct things. And we can say the Son accepts, we cannot say the Son receives in Latin. Creatures receive, the Son accepts. So the difference between Arianism, so that's just really fascinating, that receives feels for us today in English, I mean, of course it makes sense, a little less dangerous than accepts does, because for Latins it's the other way.
Yeah, that is interesting, because those words in English just don't have those histories or meanings attached to them in any literature I can think of accessing. English language theology has not used them with those senses.
I mean, you look at Albert, Bonaventure, and Thomas, and they always say, Son, Spirit accept, creatures receive. And receiving is participation, receiving is contraction, receiving is partitioning, whereas accepting is no connotation of that issues of will or social Trinitarianism. It's the opposite. It's neutral territory.
I mean, you could go for good solid Saxon words and just say give and take. Right? The
Yeah.
son takes his subsistence.
Yeah, I mean, even there, I mean, this is just the issue we're coming up against is creatures, picturing a creature and, taking, oh, then there's something that's doing the taking. But even the accepting is given. It's almost where we want to go with that. There's probably problems that arise if you push that too far, but that's really, there's nothing that the son is or has that he has not accepted eternally from the Father.
Right.
Because
you're talking about his subsistence, right? So you can't make the mistake of smuggling in a him who's already there to decide to take his subsistence.
Got it.
Right? Yeah.
Right.
Good. Okay. Well, I have the impression we've gone about as far as we can go down that road. So these are the first, these are 3 theses on the distinct personhood of the Father as an other person from the Son, here at the beginning of Junius's discussion of the Father. All right. We'll come back together next time for a few more theses on the fatherhood of the Father.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it.
All right.